I'm very glad to have Dr. Steve Johnson. So it's my pleasure to have him to talk about the most important topic in our forum. So I have one or two slides for introduction for this. And then after the introduction, I will transfer the host to Dr. Xu to organize this seminar. So this is lecture 3, Wittgenstein, Life, Philosophy, and Religion. Wittgenstein considered by some to be the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. This quote from Stanford website. And Wittgenstein provided the power tools of logic and language to solve the series of problems, especially very important conventional problem. Some problem was to be disappeared in his language theory. And also Wittgenstein is a clear thinking tradition with like Descartes, Leibniz, and David Hume. This is a common sense on work on that, and it's and he also get a very famous analogies that show the fly out of the fly bottom. So some of those researchers, especially in Chinese languages in China, mainland China, maybe 500,000 professors are doing research on a false question, a false problem. They waste the life like the fly, and then try to get out of the bottom. Yeah. So that's why we want this lecture from Dr. Steve Johnson to maybe draw a line how to fly out the bottom, and through his introduction. And our forum across the seas is like a restaurant. So today is a big dinner for everyone. So the cook is Dr. Steve Johnson. So I pass this, the next slide to Dr. Xu to make an introduction about our cook today. 徐老师，你来吧。
Okay. Professor Johnson, just his office is across the hallway to mine, and we oftentimes chat with each other and enjoy the conversation very much. Currently, he's teaching psychology, clinical counseling in the counseling department of Columbia International University, and he graduated from Indiana University, and he holds double PhDs, 2 PhDs. So, and with all these legendary stories about him, and I will probably not mention today because might be sometimes too sensitive. But he comes with all those unbelievable stories and unbelievable experiences in Judaism, in Islam, and in Christianity, of course. And he's very much well learned in philosophy, in psychology, and in a lot of other subjects. So it's very well admired by the students and by the colleagues. So it's a special honor for me to introduce to you Steve Johnson, the keynote speaker today. So Steve, it's all yours.
Thank you so much for that really nice introduction. Now I feel like I have to live up to that, but we'll do what I can. What I was thinking of is kind of in my head with Wittgenstein, it's always difficult to know where to begin. But what my approach will be is very, very little on Wittgenstein's life, because of Wittgenstein, when I was in philosophy getting my doctorate, nobody was interested in the life of the philosophers, and we didn't study the history of philosophy. We thought that philosophy began in 1963, and I'll tell you why a little bit later. And it was because of Wittgenstein. And so I would do so very little on Wittgenstein's life, but more on his, of course, his work. But during his life, was not really well published. I don't know if he would have gotten tenure at a university in the United States, because he wrote one book, one article, and one review. And that's all he wrote in his, or at least was published in his lifetime. And the review article is better than most doctoral dissertations that I have been able to read in my lifetime. And then I want to look at the work in, I mean, this is huge. I mean, to look at all of this in an hour. So try to look at the fundamental ideas in the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, and then how, in many ways, Wittgenstein repented a little bit and moved into the philosophical investigations. We'll say hello to the Blue Book and the Brown Book, with some of the things that were in there. And I usually end, when I talk about Wittgenstein, talking about how his agenda in many ways overlapped the agenda of Heidegger. Now, I have to say, I'm not a big fan of Heidegger, but I was forced to read his work in graduate school, and I'm glad I did. And today, when I go back and read him, I'm like, wow, different language. He and Wittgenstein were in many ways addressing language in a new way, and a very liberating ways. So I want to look at that, and I want to weave in this kind of real life examples about what Wittgenstein is talking about, because Wittgenstein, when we're talking about the nature of propositions and all of that, can be way up in the clouds, right? For many people, but he definitely did not want philosophy way up in the clouds. He wanted it to be right down where we live. So he was born in 1889, in the then Austro-Hungarian Empire, to this utterly, extremely wealthy family that essentially owned the Austrian steel industry, to be quite honest. And his father wanted him to go into engineering, and he did study engineering. It was very a non-traditional approach of study for someone in philosophy, to begin in engineering with math. I always feel a kinship with Wittgenstein, because my first degree at the university was in chemistry, and then I saw the light of philosophy. So, but that means I think he didn't inherit the problems that were defined as philosophical problems. He was looking at all of these things with fresh eyes. And so, instead of pursuing engineering, he became really interested in philosophical questions. And so he went to Cambridge to study with the absolute best, Bertrand Russell. And Wittgenstein quickly became Russell's absolute favorite student. And in fact, in a year or so, he didn't even consider him a student, he considered him a colleague. In fact, when Wittgenstein's sister came to the university, Bertrand Russell said, "This young man is going to solve all the problems of philosophy," okay? And Wittgenstein thought the very same thing when he finished writing the Logico-Philosophicus. So, everyone recognized his genius and his novel approach to solving philosophical problems. So, 2 years after Cambridge, he went to Norway, where he decided he should spend time in solitude, and returned to Cambridge and spent a year focusing on the study of logic and overthrowing, really, I always think of Frege and Wittgenstein as really kind of overthrowing the Aristotelian logic that was so held command throughout the world when we studied logic. But then on the eve of World War I, he returned to Vienna and, and during war, served in the Austrian army and ended up in prison in Italy. But it was during this time that he wrote the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, and in which he thought he solved all the philosophical problems that could have been solved. Again, I mean, if you've solved all the problems, then you don't need to do any more philosophy. So he quit and he became a school teacher and was a horrible school teacher, very unsuccessful as a school teacher. So he became an architect for a year or so before returning to Cambridge, and stayed at Cambridge between 1929 until his death in 1951. In that period, after writing the Tractatus, and again, I'm going to go into those in a bit more detail, he really, even though later on people think there was great diversion or split between the Wittgenstein of the Tractatus and the Wittgenstein of the philosophical investigations, he was in many ways trying to, even up to his death, to remain true to the task in the Tractatus, that philosophy could never become a science. That philosophy is not a body of doctrines. It is not a collection of truths. It's an activity, and an important activity. And frankly, less than 30 years after his death, when I started in philosophy, the first course that I took was epistemology. And epistemology, we studied none of the ancient philosophers and none of the modern philosophies. We began with Edmund Gettier's paper that he wrote in 1963, Is Justified True Belief Knowledge, in which, in a 4 or 5 page paper, using the techniques of Wittgenstein, overthrew Plato's theory of knowledge, that knowledge is justified true belief, and put us all into a tailspin. I spent my life as a graduate student in philosophy trying to work our way back into the bottle that when Wittgenstein let the fly out, because we didn't know about the history of philosophy. We began with that activity known as philosophy, which was linguistic analysis to a large degree. So I have a lot to thank Wittgenstein for that approach. I'll never forget, I had a professor who had studied Wittgenstein in great details, and he would lecture us for 2.5 or 3 hours. And then at the end of the lecture, he didn't spout, what philosophers taught. He was doing philosophy in front of us. And he wouldn't even give us a bathroom break. We stayed there for 2.5 hours. Sometimes it was 4 hours. And then at the end, he would throw his hands up and go, but I could be all wrong, And so we're like, well, what am I taking notes all this time? Because he wanted to show us the activity, not see philosophy as ossified sets of truths in an ancient logic. So I'm very, very happy about that. And so Wittgenstein was really saying that philosophy could clear up problems that were caused by inadequate uses of language. And that's how I learned philosophy. My whole dissertation was doing that. So if we dig into the Tractatus a little bit, I think in many ways he wrote the Tractatus to reveal the inadequacy of Aristotelian logic that had a hold on philosophy since the Middle Ages, before the Middle Ages. The first and only article that Wittgenstein published in his lifetime was to overthrow a relatively unknown philosopher who taught logic. And and Wittgenstein despised the way that he approached logic. And yet he said the problems with the Aristotelian logic are many. And some of those problems were, with the major one being that Aristotelian logic believed that propositions were comprised of subjects and predicates, right? That was taught when I was in school by the Roman Catholic schools, but the rest of philosophers had also given up, due to Wittgenstein, the view that propositions were subjects and predicates. He believed, Wittgenstein, that in many ways, Aristotle failed to realize the nature of the copula, or in English, the word is, right? And that the subject predicate logic didn't understand the copula in detail. And so Wittgenstein helped us to see what we say today is the is of predication and the is of identity, right? Where the is of predication would be when we make an attribution of a property to an object, right? So this book is blue is attributing blueness as a property to the book, or Steve is short, so we're attributing shortness to Steve in there. But I am Steve Johnson is not attributing any property to me. Steve Johnsonness doesn't have any properties, right? And so the old logic, then he said, to go further with this, is that it confuses objects and things with the class to which they belong, right? For example, Steve is a human. To say that Steve is considerably different than the class of humans, right? When you see Steve, you're not seeing a class of humans, right? And that's a conflation to see those as quite different. So not only that, but the old Aristotelian logic confuses classes with what we might call complexes, right? Complexes of entities. So maybe a human is comprised of human as a abstract entity is comprised of a class of individual people, whereas a bookstore is not a class comprised of individual books, right? It takes a bookstore would be a complex, because the books are not just a collection within a bookstore, but those books are in particular relationship to create a bookstore. So we have a new metaphysical entity that is being brought in to consideration, and that is a complex, right? Where there are entities in particular relationships. Later on, just a few years after Wittgenstein, there will be several branches of philosophy, critical realism, etc., that break off, grounded in Wittgenstein, that will accept his ontology there and his category of objects in his metaphysics. So whereas classes are collections of entities, complexes are collections of entities in very particular associational relationships. Okay? So the result of that is that Wittgenstein is instrumental in having logic cease to be taught by those who owned logic up to that time, and those were professors in the classics, right? Those who taught Greek and Latin and literature. And so with Frege, with Bertrand Russell, and Bertrand Russell, this was his big goal, was to essentially take that out of the classics and given to whom? The mathematicians, to be quite honest. So Russell was very excited to have a student who had trained in mathematics rather than the classics. In fact, Russell wrote that he was excited about Wittgenstein's scientific outlook. Now, as I study Wittgenstein, I understand what he means by his scientific outlook. But in many ways, Wittgenstein is trying to be a little critical here of science, as we will find later on. He's going to try to say, let's not go too far in deifying science, right? That there's something else out there that's more important. And so I want to look at that a little bit later. And so what I think Russell was excited about was that that Wittgenstein his view of logic was more in keeping with Russell and Frege at the time. So He was attacking in the Tractatus how the traditional philosophy understood metaphysical categories. So instead of just subjects, which would be objects, right, and predicates, which would be properties, he, along with Russell, just blew the top off metaphysics to include relationships, things like taller than, shorter than, hotter than, those kinds of things. Never thought of relationships as metaphysical entities until about this time, and of course classes. So propositions in this new logic were treated how? We haven't gotten to that, but how Russell, how Frege, and how Wittgenstein wanted to treat the new logic was to treat it and propositions as more like mathematical functions, if you remember functions in mathematics, right? Rather than attributing properties to objects. So this is quite different. If you pick up a book on symbolic logic today, it's all the functions, right? It is like it's a math text. And again, now these objects were seen as members of classes and in relationship to other objects in the words. Objects were associated by objects in relationships. So this new logic, this new scientific attitude viewed the work, and I was very happy to see that slide that you put up, viewed the work of Descartes and Leibniz and Spinoza and Locke and Hume and Hegel and Kant as kind of irrelevant and outdated, right? It was that philosophy was not to read through Kant. He was overthrowing the metaphysical culture. I mean, for example, in the Middle Ages, if you asked someone, if you said, in fact, there was a case where if you put two bricks, one brick on top of the other brick, and you drop them off the top of a building, which brick would fall faster? And they answered the bottom brick. And then why? How did they know? They said, because Aristotle said so, right? So philosophy was seen as that body of knowledge, and you learned it from Aristotle. Even someone like Aquinas is like a baptized Aristotle, okay? And so that view of philosophy was just overthrown here. And he said what his task in the Tractatus was to really his agenda was to formulate, analyze, and solve philosophical problems by the analysis of the inadequacies in the use of language. What seemed like problems were not problems when we looked more clearly at the use of language and in the inadequate view of propositions as we had inherited from Aristotle. So as I said, so when and Frege was quite good at this, and Wittgenstein too, is when I took epistemology, right, we learned from Gettier, and Gettier's approach was you would look at a seeming problem, analyze the language, and then you would come up with, that was the example, and then you would come up with a counter example, right? And you would show through the analysis of language, the inadequacy of the problem. And so I marvel at Wittgenstein because in many ways he was doing what Einstein was doing in science, right? Einstein wasn't in a laboratory. Einstein had thought experiments, right? And he analyzed the structure and came up with, kind of thought problems to solve the philosophical, he was solving philosophical problems. They just happened to be scientific because they were about empirical entities, right? And so I think Wittgenstein's approach, Einstein's approach, Frege's approach really liberated philosophy and made us really free. Back to the Tractatus though for a little while. What was Wittgenstein's view of propositions? And this is probably the most hotly debated part of Wittgenstein, and lots of dissertations have been written on it, right? And that is on his He saw thoughts as pictures of facts. Okay, thoughts are pictures of facts. What are facts? Facts are the existence of states of affairs. Okay, the existence of states of affairs. And so a thought is a proposition with sense. And by sense, he means just substitute the word meaning. Okay, and so propositions have sense or meaning. Objects don't. Objects don't have any meaning whatsoever. Okay, what's the meaning of Steve? There is no meaning of Steve. Steve just is, right? That's all that is. There's no meaning there whatsoever. But propositions have sense or meaning with some caveats there. So a proposition has truth functional. So we call that kind of the picture theory of propositions. You know, and it's not surprising when I look at who was influenced by, these writers, Frege's, etc. And one of those was Edmund Husserl, who went off in another area in phenomenology. And you see the stamp of Wittgenstein even on some of the phenomenologists. If you look at Sokolovsky's work, he describes propositions, much like Wittgenstein would, as states of affairs infected with syntax. I love that a proposition is a state of affairs infected with syntax. Okay, well, an important but major difficulty in Wittgenstein's treatises is that if we look at the differences among metaphysical entities like things, facts, properties, relationships, Wittgenstein said that we can't say anything that is meaningful about them. So what is the function of language? What does it have with respect to these metaphysical entities? Well, for Wittgenstein, a symbol can show, but it cannot say, right? And so this is fundamental. And I always smile when I say that because it reminds me of my 5th grade teacher when she was teaching me how to write English properly. And when she would say, show, don't tell. When you're writing show, don't tell. Don't just tell people something, but show it. And Wittgenstein, I think, would have been very happy with my 5th grade English teacher when she said that kind of thing. So, so we can't say anything meaningful about them, but does that mean that it's not worth saying anything at all? No, what he's saying is that it's not saying what we're doing, we're showing. We are showing. And I think this is going to be tremendously important, especially when we get to religion. When we get to religion, this becomes really, really, really important, I think. In philosophy, that word sense, sometimes we use it by talking about intention and extension, where the extension is the thing that a word points to, and the intention is the sense, the meaning of it, in other words. So all philosophical propositions then are nonsense. And I know that sounds very offensive to people when they read Wittgenstein, but he's not demeaning. He's not being demeaning at all about philosophical propositions. But he's saying they don't state meaning. They're showing it, but they're not stating it. Okay, so what would be he include in that category of things that don't have meaning? Well, philosophy, logic, ethics, religion, and the meaning of life. Okay, so there you go. One way to solve philosophical problems is not to see them as stating anything or having meaning. But what he does, I think, is much more liberating. But it'll take a little while before we get to that part. So they are nonsensical, all of those disciplines and the propositions in those disciplines, and they can't be stated, but they can be shown. And that is really, really, really important. Why? Because what they're showing are transcendentals that we point to, but we really can't talk about. They are inexpressible. And Wittgenstein's position is that about them, we should remain silent and show that to which they point. In the Tractatus, this distinction becomes almost impenetrable, I think in many ways because of the terseness of Wittgenstein's sentences, right? They're really terse, they're really packed, and you really, I mean, he numbers the sentences. So, you know you're going to progress through this quite logically, but they're very terse. And also not coming from a background in philosophy, he's very free, much as Heidegger was, to use terms in different ways, right? Than we were normally used to use them, okay? So in the Tractatus, this distinction almost becomes impenetrable and was actually criticized quite heavily by Bertrand Russell himself. And he made fun of Wittgenstein. He says, well, for something to be not, that we should remain silent, we can't say anything about, Wittgenstein has said a lot about it, And so I think that's where Wittgenstein responds, Bertrand Russell doesn't quite get it. He still hadn't quite understood what Wittgenstein was about. And unfortunately, that difference became personal, and Russell felt that Wittgenstein had betrayed him. He was so hopeful for Wittgenstein offering a new philosophical system, and that's not what he got, or that's what he thought he had. So, however, I think one of the disciples of Wittgenstein, and one of my favorite writers, he died very, very young, was F.P. Ramsey. And F.P. Ramsey said it, I think, better than Wittgenstein did. He said it in two different ways. And the first way is the least clear of the two. He says, what can't be said, and it can't be whistled either. I love that statement, right? But what later on, in a book by D.M. Armstrong, published, I think, mid-70s out of Australia, D.M. Armstrong quotes in chapter 1, just a phrase, a sentence or two by F.P. Ramsey. And Ramsey said, a belief is a map and something by which we steer. And I love that, because that does get at what Wittgenstein was about, and as we will see later on, more in the philosophical investigations. And that is a map points to reality without being the reality, right? It's not a statement of reality. It's pointing to reality. And it does more than just point to reality. It is something by which we navigate. So it is tied to action, real action in the world, which was very important for Wittgenstein, okay, as it was for the pragmatist later too. So I like to take a biblical example on this one, and that is the parables of Jesus, right? And I don't think that clearly the parables of Jesus are not describing reality, right? They don't even purport to describe reality. Nobody that listened to him thought that once upon a time this actually happened. They knew that he was giving a parable. And so the parable of the Good Samaritan, for example, doesn't define the term friend. It doesn't define the term mercy, or the concepts friends or concepts mercy, but they point to those transcendental values, and I think incarnate them, and which is much more powerful than a definition. I often tell my students, at a very practical level, if you belong to a church, then you probably recite the creed, and creeds are nice. I don't know if I'm ready to lay down my life for a creed, but I'll tell you, there's more powerful in a parable than all the creeds that were ever written, right? The parables of Jesus, because they are not trying to define something. They are pointing to a transcendental and put us into, kind of like Pascal says, that the heart has knowledge that knowledge doesn't know, right? And so it points to that very powerful thing that is a much deeper truth. So you can't talk about it much, but you can incarnate it and you can point to it and you can exemplify it, okay? Also in philosophy, we talk about different types of definitions now. The old Aristotelian, and Wittgenstein overthrew this, the old Aristotelian way to talk about definitions was to do what? Give it a word's genus and the differentia, right? So we talked about how it was similar to something and how it was different from something. And you put those two together, then you have a definition. So I often tell my students, guys, what I want you to do is define the word bachelor, okay? In an Aristotelian way. So you go, what is it? What is and so they would say, oh, it's an unmarried adult male. I said, what have you just done? You've told what it's like, right? It's a male, it's like males, but it's different. Unmarried, so it's not like married, right? So it's a genus et differentia, in other words, there. So another type of definition is an ostensive definition. And in the Blue Book written by Wittgenstein, he quotes someone, and I think it was Augustine. He was quoting Augustine, actually, that the way Augustine said that the way that he learned language was people would say a word and then point to what that word represented, right? What it symbolized. And at a basic level, that is true. Now, later on, we realized that that is actually a very complicated process, pointing to something, right? Anybody has a dog knows that, right? So if you want the dog to go fetch the bone and you point to the bone, the dog looks at your finger, right? They don't know to look in the direction that your finger is pointing. And even little babies will look at your finger rather than where you're pointing. So that's very abstruse and not quite as simple as Augustine thought. But that is what we call an ostensive definition, when you point to reality rather than to describe it or to define it. And then another one would be to give the necessary and sufficient conditions for a word to be defined, right? You have to give all of the necessary features, and then taken together, they have to be sufficient to define the thing. Well, and of course, there's the pragmatic definition, and that is to describe the function. But that doesn't solve that either, as John Dewey has been criticized over and over again for that. But I don't want to get off into pragmatism. So what we're left with Wittgenstein's in the Tractatus position is that there is the inexpressible, and those inexpressibles are the transcendentals that show themselves rather than are spoken about. So where does Wittgenstein leave us within this Tractatus? Well, mystery, and that philosophy is not a science or even a kind of science, right? And those who want a set of doctrines and definitions are not going to get it from Wittgenstein, okay? They're not going to get it. They will learn an activity and be invited into an activity that they can do rather than just memorize. If you want to memorize, go read Aquinas. If you want to learn to do philosophy, read Wittgenstein, okay? That's what I think the exciting part is. Because in many ways, that is like science, right? You know what I mean? You don't go off and memorize a bunch of science. You learn the scientific method and how to unpack things. And in many ways, science does overlap Wittgenstein that way, and even Heidegger to some degree. So let's put Wittgenstein #1 to rest. He's written the Tractatus, and he thinks he's solved all philosophical problems because he's solved what propositions are and clarified everything for us. And so, but then he goes away and he realizes, I didn't solve everything. In fact, there's several things that need to be addressed, and he never did get that finished. Never did. And in many ways, I think that's what the Brown Book was all about, to try to finish up what he started earlier. So there he creates something that has been really misunderstood, and I see it in people who write about Wittgenstein all the time, and that is the notion of language games. And what he calls language games, which were to overcome something, to overcome what Wittgenstein said is the craving for generality. He said philosophy, unfortunately, was craving generality. Why? Because they wanted to be like a science. And science is about generalities, right? And so, and he wanted to overcome the confusions that are inherent in craving generality. So the tendency, he said, when you crave generality is to search for something that is held in common by all the entities that are given a general term, right? The trouble is that those generalities don't exist. And let me give an example. When I have graduate students when I'm teaching psychopathology and diagnosis, I sometimes will take them to the hospital, to a psych ward or a clinic, and I will say, tell me what you see. And I don't give them any more instructions. Tell me what you see. And they will say, well, I saw schizophrenic, I saw major depressive disorder, I saw bipolar. And I went, you can't see those. You cannot see schizophrenia, right? Because schizophrenia is not a thing that has properties, right? And so what do you see? And they go, and they look at me like I have two heads, like I'm crazy. And maybe they're right on the crazy part. But I mean, I said, no, tell me what you see. Don't live in the realm of generalities. Be close to experience and tell me what you see. And once I tell them to tell me what they see, then they give me symptoms, right? And I went, thank you. Symptoms are real, generalities aren't, right? And Wittgenstein was helping us see that craving for generality has a really bad effect. It moves us away from experience in many ways. And it moves us away from the good job that ordinary language does in many ways. We use ordinary language to communicate, and we do a darn good job without philosophers there, right? It's when the philosophers kind of get involved and make mistakes, although we all make those mistakes, and we'll talk about some of those a little bit later. But that I use, Wittgenstein helped me to get my students to focus at the level of lived reality rather than craving generalities, okay? And so the other thing was that when someone comes to understand a term, of course, he had that picture theory of propositions and knowledge, that the misunderstanding is that the individual has a picture of a general term. None of us has a picture of a general term. If I say horse, you don't have a picture of general hoarseness. Most of us have a particular horse in mind if we're picturing something, right? I'm not sure whether we picture things in the mind. That's a different thing. I tend to view that other way, but that's neither here nor there now. But we don't have pictures of abstract entities, right? We have pictures of an actual thing that may be bits and pieces of a bunch of actual things, okay? So we don't understand, we don't have a picture of a general term, right? And so, but often we treat language as if we do. And then he said something that really needs to be unpacked. And I've spent, I think, maybe several years of my life trying to get my head totally around this. He says that more fundamentally, that when we crave generality, we want philosophy to be like science and to look for the general, but we also confuse what he would say is a mental state with a state of consciousness. And if we want to talk about that later, we can. It took me years to get my head around that. And I had to read a book by Reinhard Grossman that helped me on that. He came out of that Iowa School of Realism that was heavily influenced by the insights of Wittgenstein. So what's the whole point of this language game thing? Well, he sees it as a primitive form of language. And again, that's not disparaging, but a primitive form of language in which one aspect of the language is kind of disengaged from the context in which the language is situated. So let's look at that, what that looks like. So language would serve what? To help one person communicate with another person through words, gestures, facial expressions, all kinds of things, to pursue a purpose, for a function, right? For an action. So the words don't signify objects, but show us, what, in many ways, what to do or achieve what we're hoping to achieve. So if we think of speaking a language is engaging in an activity or a form of life, I think we're closer to what he's talking about with a language game. And since there are multiple forms of life, there are multiple language games, okay? Later on, some people called them speech acts. I like language game better. So for example, one kind of language game might be giving and obeying orders, right? That has a logic of its own. Or reporting an event. Now, if you confuse giving and obeying orders with reporting an event, you're really messed up. You're not communicating when you do that. Or imagining an event with reporting an event. Now, developmentally, children confuse those, right? They haven't learned those language games. So they confuse the imagining with the imagining event with the reporting of the event, or telling a joke. And I'll give an example of that one a little bit later. And all of us know when we go to a different culture and we are not in on the language games, right, that the joke falls flat because it doesn't sound like a joke, or something would be a joke there. Or praying. Praying is a language game. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. Or asking, or asserting, or creating a story and telling a story, or acting as if someone were someone else, or had a role of another person. Let me give an example of something that happened to me at church, and I'll never forget this. And again, I think Wittgenstein helped me clarify this to myself. I had this young lady that came in to see me. She was diagnosed as having bipolar 1 disorder, right? Means manic states. They can have depression with it. They don't have to, but they have to have a manic state to get diagnosed as bipolar 1. She came in and she said that she had prayed to God that her disorder she said, I told him to take this bipolar away. Okay. And she was angry because God had not done that. And I was, it hit me that she kind of confused, she missed the logic of prayer, that language game. You know what I mean? She was confusing prayer with an order and the language game of ordering, right? And it doesn't work. I mean, because it was dysfunctional in her life because she was angry with God, and yet she had a deep desire to connect with him, right? So her confusion of that language game and the logic of those language games prevented her from understanding the power and what prayer is all about, right? So I went, aha, thank God Wittgenstein had clarified that. It reminds me of that poem by Alexander Pope. It said that nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, let Newton be, and all was light. He should have said Wittgenstein, and all was light, right? Not Newton. Newton just got the science. Wittgenstein got science and philosophy there. But you see what I mean? How this young lady was confusing the language games and the logic and those language games, and knowing that we could solve not only a philosophical problem but a very practical life problem there, right? Which Wittgenstein would have been very happy for, because he saw this as part of the goal is therapy, right? It is functioning as therapy. Well, let's go back to the parables of Jesus. Telling a parable is a language game that is different from reciting a creed. And different actions are associated with kind of different understandings. One doesn't understand a language if they're confused about the rules of the language game. For example, if upon hearing a creed, one might consider an archaeological investigation or a historical investigation about the accuracy of statements that are made within creeds, right? Could do that. Are you going to do that with a parable? Are we going to launch an archaeological investigation to find out right what point did the Good Samaritan come along? No, it's a story. It's a story. We've not understood the maneuvers of that language game, and it actually impacts our actions. So for Wittgenstein, the parable may be nonsense, but only in the sense that it points to, rather than names, a transcendental. It's much powerful what that parable does than describe, okay? So I think Pascal was right that when he said that the heart has reason that reason doesn't have, but I think he failed to state that such reason is beyond saying and must be pointed to or must be shown, right? So how does Wittgenstein, how much time do, I've got to step it up here, Steve. How does Wittgenstein talk about these imponderables that are mystery? Well, he doesn't denigrate them. That's one thing. He is not denigrating the imponderables or the mystical, but he is critical of a spirit that he thinks has infected the contemporary age, and that is to deify science, but to fail to look for the imponderable evidence. And what does that mean? He's not saying that the mystery is on a shaky foundation. He's not saying that. The imponderables are not on a shaky foundation. What he means is that it's just, it's on a non-scientific form of understanding foundation, not a scientific form of understanding foundation, okay? Let me give it another example there. One of my favorite books that I read in '71 was a book called Daybreak by Joan Baez, the folk singer. And she tries to use words to describe her father. And she said, you know, that her father was a physics professor, but that doesn't say much about her father, right? And she gives a list of things about her father, and that doesn't describe her father. And so finally she says, when I see my father, I don't see my father, I see his soul. Now, what has she done? She's not describing. She is pointing to a transcendental value here of someone who loves, who is in relationship and acts on the basis of the transcendentals that she values so much. That when she saw him, she saw his soul, not a generality at all, but something that points to a valued mystery, transcendental. That's her father. So to confuse Joan Baez's language game would be to trivialize that to which her words point, right? With my children, I remember singing a song to get them to go to sleep at night, and there was a line in the song that said, and the joke was on me, right? And my daughter said, Daddy, where's that joke? I don't see it on you. And I went, no. So she thought I'm describing when I'm speaking more metaphorically, right? And so she was missing that language. That's a developmental process. Or once, and I was very amazed, and Wittgenstein came to me, she goes, Daddy, you're a girl. And I was really sad at this point. I suffer from depression. I was really quite sad. And she went, Daddy, you're a girl. And then I went, I'm not a girl. You know Daddy's a boy. And she went, I wanted to make you happy. And so she was using language and understood the function of what she was trying to achieve in the language. And it was beyond description, right? It was what he would have called the impenetrable. And there is impenetrable evidence. And she gave the evidence for that impenetrable in that statement. He's talking about day-to-day things is what he's doing, okay? The Wittgenstein philosophical investigation reminds me of some statements made by Heidegger about language, right? Heidegger said that ordinary language speaks to us silently and yet organizes the world for us. Now, that's so like Heidegger, like, come on, Heidegger, can you be clear without hyphens? But it's beautiful. It's a beautiful phrase. What does it mean? Ordinary language is not the use of a language to hide facts. It's not to do that at all, or to refrain from telling facts about the world as much as it is about having us feel the world in a particular way. Right? Experience the world in a particular way. Have the world matter to us, to be a concern for us and to move us in ways, right? Guide our ways among entities within that world. I mean, think about this. If I touch something and I say it's hot, now, there's the ordinary language use of that, right? So that means what? I touch it, and if it burns my hand, it's hot. But that's not a scientific way to talk about it. Scientists would talk about temperature. And I say, well, what is that? And they would say, oh, the temperature is the average translational kinetic energy of the molecules within the system. When I touch the table and I go, it's hot, I'm not experiencing the average translational kinetic energy of the molecules within a system. That's not in my head, right? And so it's kind of like Sir Arthur Eddington's two chairs. There's the chair of common sense experience, and then are the two tables. There's the table of common sense experience, and there's the table that the scientists tell me is a swarm of electrons constantly moving. If I experience the table that way, I would go take some antipsychotic medication, right? If I experience the table in that way, right? That's like some creative writing. Well, both Wittgenstein and Heidegger were deeply worried about the loss of mystery in the world due to science. And that's why near the end of Wittgenstein's life, he said that, and I love this statement, he said he was sad that philosophy could not capture what he felt when he heard music, right? And Heidegger said that a work of art reveals or brings to light what was in darkness, letting the truth be seen. It sounds like Pascal, right? And of course, or what about the opening of the non-synoptic Gospel of John? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word, was God, and the Word, and skip down to the 14th, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Wittgenstein would say this is scientific nonsense. But is he saying that it's not valuable? No, not at all. Not at all. It shows something that is deeply impenetrable, or as Heidegger would say, it brings to light or makes manifest that which was hidden. Because for the early Greeks, aletheia, right, was to make something manifest. That was what truth was. And the opposite for truth for the Greeks was not false, but it was to be hidden. Right? To be unconcealed. To be concealed, right? And that's what Heidegger, and that's what Wittgenstein is saying. So many philosophers today don't know what to make of Heidegger and his notion of the impenetrable mystery and his later philosophical position of poeticism. But I think that if we keep in mind that he's pointing to transcendentals that are more real in our lives than what science and technology would call the real. A real that is a problem for us today as we embrace science and lose our soul. And Wittgenstein is saying that we don't have to do that, right? He's really showing us the way that we don't have to do that. So for him, philosophy is not so much descriptive as science would be descriptive, right? Descriptive of empirical entities. But it's therapy to show deeper truths for which words fail to describe, but must be shown. And that's probably a good point for me to take Wittgenstein's advice and say, Steve, don't talk anymore. Okay, so let's end right there, and then you guys can correct me and do all of those things. Okay. And I'm sorry I went over.
Thank you, Steve. It's really not an easy topic, and you did it so help us to understand it very well. I appreciate that. I tried many times, to read the Tractatus, but many times I just, it's you like the word impenetrable. I saw that work somehow is impenetrable. And I would love to ask Professor Chang. Professor Chang, are you still here? Yes, can you turn on the speaker, and we will appreciate if you can actually respond to Steve Johnson, Professor Johnson's lecture, because you are an expert in this area. You did some comparison work between Chan Buddhism and Wittgenstein.
Oh, wow.
So amazing. That is so amazing. I didn't come across with anybody who can do comparison in these two kind of esoteric ideologies. So Professor Chang is so amazing. So he is truly an expert. Can you, Professor Chang, just to respond to Steve Johnson, his lecture?
Okay, I have to say that I may not be the expert in Wittgenstein philosophy, but I really try to understand, Wittgenstein, philosophical ideas. So when I was a student, and his philosophy, or Bertrand Russell's philosophy, is very attractive to the student in Taiwan.
Huh.
I try my best to understand. Okay, I hope I have an accurate understanding of Wittgenstein. He wrote 2 books. One is Tractatus. Another one is Philosophical Investigation. And Tractatus is trying to talk about idea language, logical language, as clear, as precise, okay, as accurate, as the mathematical or logical statement. But he discovered that we cannot do that.
Right.
So he shifted from idea language to so-called ordinary language, philosophical investigation. And he became very famous because he realized previous Western philosophers all tried to present knowledge or truth or philosophical question as clearly, as precise as mathematical or language statement. And Wittgenstein discovered that we cannot do that. We should back to ordinary language. In the meaning is not the entity or object of anything. The meaning is our ordinary use. Okay, now I compare this one to my understanding of Eastern philosophy. I may be wrong, okay? But I discovered it. This is not something new. In history of human civilization, long time ago, Eastern philosophers talk much about this. Language is a game. If you have a chance to read, Buddhist scriptures, language is a shirun, is a language, is a game. So Wittgenstein points say language is a game. For me, that is not something new. Okay. Many Oriental people talk much about it. Language is a 戏论is a game. Okay. Idea language is a game. Even Oriental language is a game. Okay. That's why I think Lao Tzu say the Tao, which can be stated or can be spoken, is not the eternal Tao. In other words, long time ago, Lao Tzu and even Buddha and many Eastern philosophers already talk about language is a game. Language does not point to any entity, does not point to so-called even a definite use. So I would say that because of lack of communication or comparative understanding or study of Western and Eastern philosopher, what considered to be the greatest achievement of 20th century philosophy is not something new.
Right.
This is already have been spoken by Taoist philosopher, also by the Buddhist philosopher, and the article I wrote is about Zen Buddhist monks. The Zen Buddhist monk, long time ago, they already know language is a game. Therefore, they claim that Buddha had preached 45 years. He never opened his mouth. So I think we need to have more comparative study of Eastern and Western cultures. So when I was a student, I really couldn't figure out why Wittgenstein is considered the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. He created something new idea. I don't see that. Okay, sorry, this is a comment I want to say today.
Okay. Okay. So,
Oh, Steve, do you have any feedbacks?
I loved that statement. I absolutely loved it. I think Wittgenstein would have loved that, because I think he is telling us that we became so enamored with science, right? And that science won the day. I mean, and science did good things. I'm not making fun of science, but I think he would have said science won. But I think what he and Heidegger are saying is, but it's a Pyrrhic victory. It's a victory of won at too great a cost, or who by, you can gain the world but lose your soul. I mean, and so I think he's bringing us back down to the ordinary language, where for centuries we've done a great job of communicating to get things done, and then we tried to treat it as science and created problems rather than. I was just thinking about that when we read hermeneutics, right? We learn all kinds of ways of understanding scripture that people before pre-scientific revolution were quite adept at understanding scripture in many different ways, right? And part of what they were doing was linguistic analysis, to be quite honest. And because they understood symbolism, they understood all kinds of things. And so I agree with the professor that Wittgenstein is calling us back to the wisdom of ordinary language, right? And how it can guide our actions in light of those transcendentals.
Yeah. Liang Jie, do you want to say something?
Yeah, we have before the lecture, we actually have 2 or 3 questions. And your lecturer has already mentioned that, but we want to clearly to bring this question to you is here. And Wittgenstein and Heidegger. We said, for scientific, I'm a scientist. We evaluate these two philosophers. We say, okay, Wittgenstein at least lay eggs. Heidegger, metaphysics, no eggs at all. So the real question is that, we're talking about the language game. And Heidegger has a lot of concept, and according to the theories of Wittgenstein, is Heidegger's key concept had any meaning? It sounds like no sense. So I need your comment on this question.
I don't know that I'm qualified to speak authoritatively on Wittgenstein. I don't consider myself real knowledgeable on Wittgenstein. When I read Sein und Zeit, I threw it across the wall and it bounced off the wall the first time. I thought, this is it's just terse, or what is the meaning of meaning and things like that. I mean, I think he is going in the exact direction in some ways that Heidegger is criticizing, On the other hand, maybe not, maybe the professor's right and he's speaking more like, in Zen. I have no idea. But I do know that I think that the way I see Wittgenstein talking about language and language games comes much closer to what the American pragmatist would call the pragmatic theory of truth, right? That the truth of a proposition or the truth of a statement is in the results of it or in the function of it. Actually, I don't think that it's really the pragmatic theory of truth. I think it's a pragmatic theory of meaning, right? Rather than a pragmatic theory of truth. So if I say that the rock is hard, the meaning of that would be shown what? Taking the rock and whacking yourself on the head will give you one way to help you understand that, right? Etc. Rather than going off on a scientific or even an Aristotelian way of doing that. So maybe it's because of being raised on American pragmatism that I was already set to understand Wittgenstein and appreciate that his focus on the use of the language rather than the Aristotelian understanding of propositions, etc.
Thank you. That's
Thank you.
Yeah. And the next question is, I recently read articles about the faith is what God reveals in a man. And also this is a quote from an article called Philosophy to the Glory of God, Wittgenstein on God and Religion. And also make a comparison is that Heidegger also wrote a book, is Only a God Can Save Us. But in 1933, Heidegger joined the Nazi Party and was elected as the rector of the Freiburg University. Actually, he believes that God is a false God. So my question is that I think the big difference is that in Heidegger is talking about God is like something, some animals. It's not a real God. That when we do research on Heidegger. So I think Wittgenstein's, no matter how people call him, but he's not atheist. So what do you think,
No, I agree with you. And if I can put my psychology hat on for a minute and take the philosophy hat off, is when I look at Heidegger, I see a similar kind of personality structure to that of Jean-Paul Sartre, right? Both atheist, both narcissist, right? Total flaming narcissist. And so I think that and we see, and I think it's very hard for, I mean, I don't think it's impossible for a narcissist to believe in God, but it's kind of hard when you want the glory for yourself in the same way and want, you know, others in the environment to reflect your specialness, right? It's a little bit hard because God becomes kind of a rival then, right? But I think Wittgenstein, no, I wouldn't call him an atheist by any stretch of the imagination there. I think and I think his notion of language game and the idea of mystery and the impenetrable, that language can show it, but it doesn't describe it. I think it is to grasp the is just really, really a powerful way to talk about to talk about awe when we stand in the presence of that mystery that we call God.
Thank you.
Okay, we have here Professor Kate Zhou. He graduated from Princeton University and taught political science in University of Hawaii. And she has a question related to her specialty about the relationship between faith and the rise of socialism and Marxist-Leninism in the 20th century. Professor Zhou, do you want to state your question, rephrase your question, see if we can ask Steve to relate it to provide some pertinent answer to your question.
Yes. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
I can.
Okay. It's a great lecture and then very difficult to have to re-listen and to understand. But I have been, writing an article recently about the left, Western intellectuals, mostly left intellectuals in the West, including the United States, and the rise of socialism in China, especially support of Asian Marxist state, and led to the murder and the slaughtering of millions of people. Okay, so I think that they have blood in their hand. So I think that I do look at least in China, a lot of Christians and organizations, Christians, especially Catholics, play a very key role in the rise of Mao's China in the 40s, 30s, 40s, and in the world is like that. And I do think that in the United States today, we can see that there's left political correctness and using racism as a way to attack traditional culture and Christianity. But many of the religious people also become part of I call the Marxist the rise of new Marxists in the West. So I would really want to find out what role Christianity played, a negative role played for the death of millions of people who believe in Marxism. Thank you very much.
Yeah, again, that is way out of, it's certainly not something that I'm an expert on, but I tell you, the person who helped me understand the rise of Marxism and Nazism, right? Was Paul Tillich. And when Paul Tillich I always liked when he was talking about ultimate concern, and he uses it, the phrase in like in a double way, right? It's not just any concern, it's ultimate concern. But and what he said is that but the concern has to be about a true ultimate. If it's not about a true ultimate, then it is not a true ultimate concern. It is a demonic concern, right? And he uses the word demonic, maybe not in the traditional Christian use of the word demonic, but when we take that which is that is not an ultimate, something like an ideology, Marxism, Nazism, and we give it those kind of godlike qualities and allegiance that only should be going to God, that is truly demonic. And he said that is a huge problem within the church, and we have to be very careful about that. He said, is that if we don't if we're not ultimately concerned, and we don't have true concern about that which is ultimate, then we open ourselves up for all kinds of manipulation. But it was Erich Fromm who had just come out of the whole Hitler fiasco, and was said that there is something within men that don't want to assume responsibility, right, and to accept our freedom, and that he wrote the book Escape from Freedom, about all the ways that we try to escape from freedom. And I think Marxism and socialism, Marxism and Nazism and some of those ideologies give people ways to escape freedom. I think some of the hardest verses to hear is when we hear all things are lawful. As humans, we don't want to hear that, right? Maybe if you're a teenager and you think, okay, that means anything goes and I can do whatever I want, but then they don't read about not everything is expedient, right? And so, but I think for many people that's quite scary to accept that freedom, for example, that you may have in Christ, and so they run away from it. And I think they gravitate to all kinds of realities that promise truths and that they can't deliver on.
Thank you very much. I need citations for those authors. If you can give to Nancy, I can read that.
If you email me, I can give you the name of the book by Tillich and then Erich Fromm too.
Okay, thank you.
And I'm a cognitive psychologist, so for me to recommend Erich Fromm, who's in the enemy camp, means I must really like him, So I'll be happy to do that.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
At least for the Tillich one, it's in his first volume of Systematic Theology, his discussion on God.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he took that from Heidegger. I mean, it was based on Heidegger's writing, right?
Yeah. Anybody else want to provide insights or feedbacks?
Can I say a little bit more about so-called
course.
idea language and ordinary language? The idea language Wittgenstein talk about is really not that idea, quite ordinary. The ordinary language he want to emphasize, and many people say, oh, that is a great change, a great achievement. Really, it's not that ordinary. It's very abstract. Okay, I give you an example. Water is H2O, right? Water is H2O. Okay, now, if we go to the restaurant, okay, I can, very simple, just give me, ordinary language, everybody can know, give me H2O. toilet water is H2O, Coca-Cola is H2O, beer is H2O, okay? So H2O, if waiter just give me some toilet water, you know, that is ordinary object, ordinary meanings too. Actually, it's very abstract. Ordinary language is not that easy. You know, you want to be precise. It's not depend upon the use. You know, many philosophers talk about ordinary use, those to, you know, logical analysis. Analytical philosophers, they think, you know, ordinary use or meaning is depend upon use. That use itself is very abstract. It's not ordinary. Okay, that is what I want to say.
Dave, what do you think about the toilet water?
I just don't want to give restaurants any ideas, so I'm not going to say anything on that one, right? You know, it's really, but when I hear, it's really, I think this, what Wittgenstein didn't know about, that we know about now, is that when we think about the use of something and how we communicate is far deeper within us humans than we realize. For example, we now know, and we're not the only animal that has them, but we have far more than any other, are the mirror neurons, right? So that, and mirror neurons allow us to have morality because they allow empathy, but also they allow us to understand kind of what the actions of another person are about, right? Even language. And so that it's so fascinating for me when I study mirror neurons is that if I'm in the restaurant and I walk in and the waiter or waitress has their hand on the glass of ice water or whatever it is, I know whether they're either putting it down or they're taking it away. Simply because subtle differences in that, and my mirror neurons can know which one they're doing. You know what I mean? That level of connection that we have that is part of our ordinary language too, I think, you know? And, but it's all about what? So that we in community can, you know, that we can communicate and survive and love, have meaning, and stay connected, right? It's beautiful.
Steve, I have a brief question because seems logical positivism sustained a lot of criticism. It's been almost like being dismissed, but I do see some value, great value in that kind of language. As you probably read the news that the Chinese Ma roller Tianwan just landed Mars maybe 10 hours ago. So it is this kind of positive language, a positive, logical, positivistic language, scientific language that offer the possibility of the Chinese scientists to accomplish such kind of marvelous accomplishment. Because if we use the Confucian language or the axiological language, with those ambiguities, without the accuracy, objectivity, and precision, we probably can never reach that kind of stage of science. So it's truly, it's marvelous. I think Wittgenstein is very correct, only that maybe it's not sufficient, but it's a great achievement for him to point out that we do need that kind of language.
Yeah, I like that. I think the one that influenced me the most on this one actually was a Roman Catholic theologian and philosopher. He taught at Harvard for some time, and that was Bernard Lonergan. Wrote a book called Understanding, which is really quite quite good. He wrote that in the 50s, I believe. And he talks about this differentiation of consciousness. And he points out that this is reflected in our language. So for example, at the level of just, let's say in the Greek plays, they had, I mean, the early Greeks had no language for interiority, right? Everything was externalized. So reflected in the Greek plays, instead of talking about what a person was thinking, they would have the gods engaging in dialogues, right? That would reflect what was going on outside. And then we see later on when Aristotle writes, and even the difference between Plato and Aristotle has a very systematic approach. He has, you know, when he, in his axiology, right, it's the mean between two extremes, except, you know, for virtue is. And so he can systematize to the nth degree and drive you crazy, right? He can use that systematic language. But then Lonergan says there was another differentiation of consciousness that was also systematic language, but it was different than Aristotle, and that was science. And so Aristotle related ideas to the self. Scientists don't relate it to the self. They relate idea to idea, right? And so where we talk about heat or something that's hot, I'm relating some object in relationship to myself. Science talks about temperature, the average translational kinetic energy, the molecules in a system. It's relating those molecules in a system, right, to each other and to a temperature, a thermometer, etc. And so there's no relationship to the self and the self's experience of that, right? And they called that objectivity. That was a very important differentiation of consciousness. Aristotle's differentiation of consciousness was much to be preferred because it could get into the interiority and transcendentals and all of that. And I think what Wittgenstein is saying, he's not criticizing science, but he is calling us back a little bit. And in many ways, I think what Lonergan is saying is the differentiation of consciousness of Aristotle is different than the differentiation of consciousness of science. Both are needed.
I believe so. I believe so. Yeah, you're right. You're right. We do need the scientific language to carry out research, but also we need a language we can communicate with our beloved ones. So I think both are very essential, both are necessary. And I have another question about Wittgenstein, his concept of language or word, because given the fact that he, at least at a later stage of his life, he claimed himself to be a Christian, he must be very familiar with the concept of the logos, the concept of the word, W-O-R-D word, like, beginning of the Gospel of John. And carries meaning, carries value, carries truth, which is very different.
And action.
Yeah, which is very different from his understanding of language. And it's the word, the divine word, expressing that's the impenetrable meaning. That's the revelation. It's word is, with God, and word is God, and it's truth. It's just per se, it's truth. So I don't know, did Wittgenstein have any thoughts in that direction?
Honestly, I have not read Wittgenstein much on religion, which sounds kind of funny for me not to have read that, given how much I value religion, right? But when I listen to Wittgenstein and the way that he, more in the philosophical investigations than in the Tractatus, right? But in the philosophical investigations, I find him, I can understand the opening of gospel of John's gospel. In light of Wittgenstein, you know what I mean? I can do that because for me, Wittgenstein makes a wonderful case without saying it for the value of the incarnation, where the transcendental becomes flesh and we can see it, right? Because then we show, we don't tell, right? The creeds do the job of trying to tell us what it is, and I'm happy for the creeds. If we don't have them, then life in the church might be nasty, brutish, and short, right? But it without the incarnation. Well, can I give it this? And I don't mean to criticize the church here, because when sometimes I would say to somebody in a church, where can I find out what your faith is? And so they would direct me to their website, and it would say a faith statement. And I read it, and it's not a faith statement. It's a set of beliefs, right? And I went, that's not faith. You've given me a set of beliefs. But if I go, okay, Steve, read those as signs pointing to some transcendental value, right? I don't know that that's what they want me to do when I read their faith statement, but I'm like, faith in the Gospels is so much bigger than belief, right? It's so much bigger. And I think that's part of what we've done, is that we've boiled it down to, and I think that goes with the professor. It's complicated in many ways. And because it's so complicated, we have to point. And thank God for the incarnation, right?
Mm-hmm. 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 It's just it's a very this kind of a revelation, this level of revelation is just engaging the truth with the word logos. It's just I believe that is probably maybe pointed a huge challenge to logical positivism.
Yeah. And I think it served a purpose of precision when we got really murky in philosophy. But it doesn't have the final word. And if I go back to Lonergan's Differentiation of Consciousness, and so there was systematic level of language and of consciousness rather. But he said there's another level of differentiation of consciousness that some people never reach, and that is of being in love, right? Mm-hmm. And being loved. And that, some of the hardest counseling I've ever had to do is when couples come into the counseling center, and the woman or one of them will say, he doesn't love me or she doesn't love me. And I'm like, here's the trap. Because how do you use language to prove that you love someone? Because she'll say, well, didn't I do that? Well, that doesn't mean you love me. And I'm like, please don't fall for that. Don't go down to that black hole. You know what I mean? Because there's no way you can prove that. You've got to show it, And I think I learned that from my daughter, that sometimes you have to. So she was, it was Halloween, right? And she was really little, like 3 years old. And she was all dressed up. She was all excited. She took off running and she fell on the sidewalk and she scraped her knee. And here I am, a psychologist. So I run up and I'm trying to say all the right words to make her feel better. And she said, Daddy, no words, just hugs. And so that's it. That's it, right?
That's so good. Yeah. So anybody here have any more questions?
Can I have some comment?
Please.
Sure.
And also possibly a question. It's great to hear from Professor Johnson. I think from my understanding, it seems that Wittgenstein's language game concept has great truth. I found that has great truth in poetry writing, because in those creative art, in those writing, we never states, and we use language, and to show or to point to a transcendental identity or ideas to convey feelings or not knowledge, but to communicate. So I found that's very interesting, and I think I have read some people in this literature world has written about the relationship between Wittgenstein and poetry or writing. But I'm curious, given his background, when I Googled him, he was raised by his dad, who was a great art sponsor. Could he be influenced somehow or inspired some way by arts when he was trying to solve this philosophical problem? Can you talk about it?
Well, it wouldn't surprise me because his family was a big musical family, right? Too.
Right.
And he loved music, and I think I even gave kind of his quote or alluded to the quote where he was kind of sad when he was thinking about that he couldn't get across in philosophy, but what he could experience in music.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, the scientific language is never enough.
Yeah, and you know what? For often, and I remember a professor in college. I wanted to take an elective, and I thought, let me take something fun. I don't want to have to think too much when I do this. But I took a course that made me think, and it was a music appreciation course. And the professor was a pianist, and he goes, you know the most important part of the music? And we said, no. And he said, the moment after the last note.
Mm-hmm.
And I went, wow, and I'm like, that's kind of like poetry for me.
Yeah.
The moment after that, or when you listen to someone, perform, sometimes when it's so beautiful, there's silence before people start applauding. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It is that.
It's beyond language.
Beyond language, but something we all share, and we don't even, and when we try to communicate it, our language is imprecise, but it does a good enough job that we get what each other is saying. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Absolutely. And the show, not tell, this principle is such an important principle, not only in literature writing, creative writing, but also in our faith life. A lot of times we tell people, how to be a Christian, but we often fail by not acting, by not living a Christian life. Like the saint, I think, Assisi.
Oh, St. Francis.
St. Francis of Assisi said, always preach Jesus, when necessary, use words.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
The words itself is just like a language of game, right? People won't appreciate your words as much as your actions, your way of life. So that's very inspirational.
And again, I was in a church, and they gave me an assignment to work with the deacons, and the deacons had the responsibility to kind of listen to the testimony of individuals, before they would baptize them. And so I said, what do you listen for? And they went, well, they have to say that Jesus is their Lord and Savior, and that and I'm like, okay, is that all? And they go, yeah. And I said, oh, can I try this? Because I've never done that. And so I had the person, she said the words, she said, yeah, I accept Jesus as my Lord and Savior. And then I thought, I don't know what it was, some feeling or something, I don't know. And then I said, so how do you make decisions in life when you have a decision? And she goes, well, first I go consult my horoscope and then I pray about it. So I'm like, okay, maybe there's something else. Maybe we need to look at how what they say gets translated into action in life, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what Jesus was teaching us. Some may say his name and using his name to do things, miracles, all that. But he would say, "I will never know you." That's, yeah.
And the biblical scholars, I mean, I'm not a biblical scholar, but they tell me that 60% of what Jesus spoke about was in the form of parables.
Yeah.
You must have a reason for doing that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You're right. You're right.
That's great. Thank you.
Well, time flies fast, and we are almost reaching 2 hours. So it's time for us to wrap up here. And unless anybody here want to burst out with some comments and insights, otherwise we will just call it a day. And we appreciate, Steve, your lecture and your presence, and wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. I would love, I mean, I think that this is a great kind of forum. It would be nice to just have like conversations or to read something in common and start sharing, you know, it would be so much fun to do that. And I think that listening to people from other cultures is always exciting. I never heard this about Zen and Buddhism. That's exciting for me. So I'm going to have to call Amazon and get me a new book, okay, and see what I can do there. But thank you guys very, very much.
After reading it, just let us know. Probably we can set up some dialogue between you and Professor Chong.
That would be fun.
That's
would be
good.
really fun.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful. We will call it a day, and this will be end of today's lecture. We appreciate Steve. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Johnson.
Thank you. I'm enjoying. I'm very glad to have this lecture.
I'm going right to bed, but thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye-bye.